Okay, good evening and welcome to Black STEM Futures. This is our speaker series and tonight we're joined by two PhD students from the University of Cambridge. I think we probably will be joined by a few more people in just a bit, but we will get started and I'm sure more people will join in just a little bit. So we've got two speakers with us this evening and I'll let them both introduce themselves in just a second. But before I do so, just in case you've not yet used Zoom webinar somehow in the last year, just to give you a little idea of how this evening is going to work. So every event that we hold, we do so to help everyone explore the science of genomics and science more generally and what it means for our lives. So we do invite you to ask questions for our speakers tonight, but we ask you to do so respectfully to our speakers and everyone else sharing the space. I'm here to moderate the space and to make sure it is safe and inclusive for everybody. If you've not used Zoom webinar before, you won't be able to use your camera or your microphone this evening. So if you need to get in contact with us, ask our speakers questions, or if you're having any issues yourself, you can use the chat box below to ask us a question, to sort of get in touch. If you've got sort of specific questions for our speakers about their careers or their work, pop them in the Q&A box because that just helps us to find them a little bit later. We also have closed captions available, so if you'd like those, you can click the little CC box and they should pop on the screen. You can move them around, so if they're in the way, move them. Likewise, if you don't want them, you can also get rid of them as well. That's all that I wanted to cover, just to check that everyone knew how to use the platform. But with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will let I'll ask you to both introduce yourself quickly, just so we know who we've got with us. So Kagiso, do you want to introduce yourself for everybody?
Sure, yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Kagiso. I'm a second year PhD student, again, as already said, in the University of Cambridge. And my PhD involves looking at semiconductors for device applications, mainly as light-emitting diodes.
And Aisha, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Yusuf, and I also am a PhD student from the University of Cambridge. And my PhD focuses on early detection of esophageal cancer, which is the cancer of the esophagus.
Awesome. So we're going to be hearing from both Kagiso and Aisha this evening. I'm going to let Kagiso take over from here.
Okay. So I just share the whole screen. I think that should work. Okay. So can you confirm that my PowerPoint is now up?
Yeah, okay. Looks great.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this section of the Black STEM Futures speaker series. As already stated, my name is Kagiso Loeto, and during this talk, what I'll try to give you is sort of a personal history-ish, and also try to introduce what I work on and the broader subject that I'm involved in. When I was trying to come up with this talk, I realized that when I started to introduce more material with regards to exactly what my PhD is about, I tended to introduce a lot of complex science very easily. So what I'll do instead is I'll focus more on the general subject of material science, and then just a bit at the end introduce what I actually do. So that is me. That is Kagiso. That is your presenter, and I am from Botswana, and that's where I spent 18 years as a living being. So after doing my high school, which is equivalent to GCSEs in the United Kingdom, I gained a scholarship to come and, well, to be able to go and study anywhere in the world. And just like any sort of sane person, I decided to pick the place with some of the worst weather ever. It's supposed to be an island, but it's not the the prettiest of islands. But jokes aside, I decided to do my A-levels in Cardiff. So I decided to come to the UK. Spent 2 years in Cardiff, and these were my A-level results. So I did pretty good, and I was impressed with myself. Then, given that I got really high marks, I applied to some of the best universities, if we can say. So these included Imperial College London, the University of Cambridge, the University of Manchester, and also Birmingham University, right? So, and I got an offer from all of the universities that I just stated. So it should make sense that, okay, if you did have an offer from all of these universities, then it's quite obvious that you will pick Cambridge, right? So this is me. So this is a news excerpt that was done in collaboration with my A-level college. And you can see here that Kagiso did indeed get an offer from the University of Cambridge and was supposed to do natural sciences. And these were my offer sort of requirements, which I did end up meeting. But however, as you can guess from how I'm talking about this, I didn't actually go ahead with picking Cambridge. I actually rejected Cambridge for Imperial College instead. And the main reason I did that was that I did not like how the course was set up in the University of Cambridge. So it says here natural sciences, but what I actually wanted to do was material science. So in Cambridge, you would start off with 3 other subjects, including material science, which would be like 25% of everything that you do. And I did not quite like that. And obviously, there was a lot of resistance, especially from the school that I went to, not necessarily with my parents or my family, but mostly the school. But regardless, I ended up making the decision to go to Imperial College London to study materials science, as I just said. So essentially what I'm saying is you shouldn't be, or I'm not trying to say reject Cambridge and accept Imperial. This isn't a sale for universities. What I'm trying to get at here is that ultimately you should be making decisions for yourself and not necessarily for other people, right? So your career path is not necessarily set in stone. So by the mere fact that you did gain an offer to go and study in the University of Cambridge doesn't necessarily mean that you should accept that offer, right? So I ended up going to Imperial College, spent 4 fruitful years. And as you can see by that smile, I quite enjoyed making that decision. So things ended up going full circle. So I ended up going back to the University of Cambridge, and I'm currently, as I introduced at the start of the section, I'm a second year PhD, also studying material science. And this material science is what I want my talk to be about mainly. And yeah, this is me during matriculation before coronavirus actually disrupted such large gatherings. Cool. So that was a brief overview of my academic history. But like I said, I want to talk more about this subject of material science. So I'm not sure how many people are there in the participants. I think there are 3 people. So just type in yes or no if you've heard of the subject of material science, sometimes called materials engineering or material science and engineering. So I'll just give you a few seconds, just type in yes or no, I've heard of this. I have never heard of this before. Okay, we're getting.
One of our students has said no. I definitely
Yep.
don't think I'd heard about it at school. I think,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, maybe engineering is the nearest I would have known about.
Okay, so given that we have like, I think only 3 other people, the majority is no, including M. And there's a question also, which I'll get back to, I guess, at the end of my talk.
Yeah, we'll save that
Okay,
for then.
cool. So material science isn't as popular or as well known as the more established sciences and engineering. So if I say mechanical engineering, most people would know what I'm talking about. If I say physics, if I say chemistry, most people also know what I'm talking about, right? But material science is none of those. and it's mainly because it's a fairly new sort of type of science or type of congregation of scientific fields. And if I now go back to this, and if you look at the definition from the this is from the Oxford Material Sciences, Oxford University page, right? And it describes material science as the study of the relationship between the structure and properties of materials. And that's what I really think it is the core of material science. And that's something that I really want to expand upon in this talk, right? So as already stated, it's an interplay between the structure and the properties of material, all materials, right? So what do we mean firstly by structure? So structure is the arrangement of atoms or molecules or ions within a material, right? So this actually allows us to classify different types of materials based on this sort of structure quality here, right? So we can have materials classified as metals, materials classified as ceramics, semiconductors, biomaterials, polymers, and nanomaterials. And this also all just stems from how we're able to classify those based on how the atoms, how the molecules, and how the atoms within these types of materials are arranged, right? And if you really think about it deeply, we're not just talking about the arrangement of atoms, right? I mean, yes, indeed, we are talking about the arrangement of atoms, but that specific arrangement of each specific arrangement leads to different types of sort of interactions between the molecule, between the electrons that form that material, right? And all of these interactions will then lead to different properties, right? And what I define property, or what I define as a property, is a useful quality of a material. So now, second question for the chat here is, can you name any useful properties of material? So think in general about any sort of material that has a specific purpose, right? And then try to link that purpose to its properties. So just can you name in general any properties of materials that you can think of? And we'll expand on this further. Five, four, three, two. Okay, we have. Yep, rubber elasticity. Okay, yeah. That's definitely a property, yes. So now back to this.
We've got another answer that polymers are strong.
Polymers are strong.
So I guess strength being the property.
Yes, strength is a property of material, but I wouldn't necessarily associate it with polymers. But strength is also in this table that I have here. So good, but not necessarily a property that's associated with polymers. So here I have named some properties of materials, so the strength, the hardness, the electrical conductivity, something called the diamagnetism, color, something else that's called superconductivity, right? So what I'm trying to actually get you to realize here is that all of these properties, yeah, and there are many more other properties that I can mention here, all of these properties actually stem from the structure of the material itself, right? So for instance, the property of hardness is usually associated with ceramics. So ceramics are usually termed as very hard, right? And just to define what I mean by hardness here, hardness is the ability of a material to resist surface scratches, right? So if you find it really, really difficult to sort of damage the top surface of a material, then that material is hard. And again, that's usually associated with ceramics. So for instance, if you think about china, in your kitchen, so your plates and whatnot, it's really, really hard to actually scratch the surface of your china. And again, that's because the china is a ceramic and ceramics are hard, right? Then another property that's quite useful for engineering purposes, especially for structural materials, is strength. And a strength is associated with both metals and ceramics, right? So strength is really just how much sort of pulling force do I need to apply before my material breaks. Cool. And again, there are other properties here. Another one I'd like to mention is electrical conductivity, which is, again, is the main, so the main thing here is structure properties. So if I can now give some examples of materials, their structure, and how that structure actually relates to the properties. So starting off here is a material that I actually work with, and I'll actually talk a whole lot about during this during this presentation. So this is gallium nitride, and gallium nitride is a semiconductor, and it's made out of atoms or ions of gallium, which are shown here in yellow, and also ions of nitrogen, which are shown in, I want to say white or in a grayish type of color, right? So, and this is actually, if you've studied any chemistry in GCSE or in A levels, this structure is analogous to the structure of diamond that you've seen in your classes, right? The only distinction, or one of the distinctions here being that we have two types of atoms. So for diamond, you would simply have all of these atoms, all of these positions being filled up by carbon, but in our case, they're filled up by both nitrogen and gallium, right? So the fact that the gallium and the nitrogen order themselves in this way, and what we're looking at is the simplest unit, well, not necessarily the simplest, but one of the simplest units of the structure. And if you think about it, the material that you have will be tessellations of this type of unit. So this unit will then repeat multiple times to infinity, creating now your material, right? And as I said, the fact that the ions are ordering themselves in this manner means that gallium nitride is a semiconductor, right? And it's actually a semiconductor that is used for LED bulbs. And this is what LED bulbs look like, and hopefully you should have been able to see LED bulbs. I think at this moment, they're the more popular bulb for general lighting applications. So in my room and in the kitchen and probably in all of the house, the lighting is mainly LED bulbs, right? And the reason that why we've moved from your fluorescent or incandescent type lighting to LEDs is that compared to those, LEDs have a higher conversion efficiency, as in you only need a small amount of electrical current or power applied to your LED material to get a lot of light out, right? So which means that if everyone switches to LEDs, then we're able to save a whole lot of electricity, which is good for the environment. We're expending less carbon and also emitting less carbon into the atmosphere because we're needing less and less energy, right? So this is gallium nitride. Then secondly, we're going to look at this thing here. So this is a carbon nanotube, right? And again, taking it back to GCSE chemistry or A-level chemistry, if you've talked about graphite, then you should know that graphite consists of sheets of graphene stacked on top of each other. And these sheets of graphene are bonded by van der Waals forces to each other. But within the sheet, you have very strong covalent bonding. So imagine if we now just like take one of these sheets, which are called graphene, and we roll the sheet to create this nanotube structure, right? And actually, when these things were first discovered, there was a lot of research effort. Then there was a lot of talk in the press of how these things are going to revolutionize technology and do other things. One of the I don't want to say the craziest one, but one of the most interesting ones was that these things were found to be really, really strong, which they are, by the way. And there were people thinking that they could be able to build a space elevator, as in, given that these things are really, really strong, we could make cables out of them, which would be able to hold elevators that might be able to go to space. But obviously that didn't necessarily materialize, and the research effort with regards to carbon nanotubes declined with time, and people started looking at other things, which just goes to show that science is very ebb and flowy. There are a lot of things that come in, and there are a lot of things that go out that don't necessarily stick, that don't necessarily change the way that we see the world, or change the way that we actually interact with the world, or make our lives easier. So at this point, after saying all of that, I want to ask the chat a question again, as to now, what materials can you think of that did actually revolutionize the way that we interacted with the world, or that ended up making our lives easier? So just name any material that you can think of that you definitely know that, okay, yeah, this changed the course of human history. And it's not carbon nanotubes, by the way.
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think we ever think about like materials that change. I think we often think about products, but we don't often think about materials themselves.
Yeah. So a way that I would is something that you don't actually think about. Something that's the most mundane, everyday thing, right? Those are usually the things that actually change the world. Like, they are so ambivalent. I'm not sure if that's the word, but they're everywhere, right? That we don't actually think about them.
We've got one guess of concrete, which was definitely what I was thinking as well, as something we can use for lots of stuff. Concrete, yes.
Cotton, definitely. I mean, and if I look just a bit above in the chat, there were polymers that were mentioned, which is true. Rubber, which is also true, right? So which just goes to show that once a material actually embeds itself, it becomes very everyday now. It doesn't become as flashy, right, as it was probably the case when it actually started to revolutionize the way that we performed human activity. So another one, which is probably the most obvious one, is steel. Oh yeah, we just got metal.
Someone just got metal.
Yeah, but I would mostly not just any metal, but steel as a metal. So this is probably the most used material out there. So steel, it's basically used in a lot of things. Then another one, for technological reasons, is silicon, right? So we have, I think it's Palo Alto, the valley in the US with all the Microsofts and the Apples. It's called Silicon Valley because of that, right? Because silicon ended up revolutionizing electronics, which is actually a funny story, because silicon is not really the best semiconductor, as there are better semiconductors that we should definitely be using, but it's just the fact that people just decided to start using silicon. And at this point in time, we know how to make silicon very, very well, and also very, very cheaply. Even though it's not the best semiconductor, we can make it cheap enough, right? That the fact that it's not the best isn't such a big problem. But recently there has been a shift to more better semiconductors, such as gallium nitride, which is what I talked about earlier, and others such as gallium arsenides, which if we do end up finding cheaper ways of making those, it would change the performance, or actually increase the performance of our electronics. And then we can move a bit further into the future, if you will. So carbon nanotubes, again, as I've said, they've been relegated. They're not as flashy anymore. So one of the applications that I was actually able to find is something called gecko tape, which is, a strip of tape. But if we could be able to zoom within the tape, we would find these carbon nanotubes sticking out like fingers out of the tape, right? So the way that the tape actually works is not by chemical adhesion, like normal tape, right, which uses chemicals that stick to each other. So this one works in the same way as a gecko or spiders, for instance. So this is from the earliest Spider-Man movies, the one with, I forgot the actor's name now. So it's not the one with Tom Holland, not the one with Andrew Garfield, the one with, the name is gone. But anyways, in the film, when Spider-Man, or Peter Parker, was starting to gain his powers, you started to see the appearance of these hairs, these small like hairs, which allowed him to stick to walls and things. And that's basically how this gecko tape works. So instead of chemical adhesion, it works by providing really, really small hairs, which are in this case carbon nanotubes, that allow for a electrostatic sort of adhesion to surfaces. And that's what I'll say. So another material which gets ignored a lot, but actually changed the way or made life very, very easy, especially if you're a scientist, or especially if you drink a lot of drinks, is glass, right? So without glass, we wouldn't have transparent windows, most likely. You wouldn't be able to drink from a glass cup. Chemists especially wouldn't have glass tubes to do the chemistry work and all the other things that glass actually does. And glass is, I'd say, special-ish compared to the two materials that we talked about, especially gallium nitride. So if we look above at gallium nitride, we can see that there's a lot of order in the structure, right? So the gallium atoms, or the gallium ions, choose specific points within the structure, and you always find them at those specific points. And it's the same thing with the nitrogen ions as well. But with silicate glass, which is made out of oxygen and silicon as its main components, there isn't a lot of order, or a lot of long range order, if I can put it like that, right? So the red atoms seem to be haphazardly spread, and also the same with the blue atoms. They seem to be haphazardly spread. So this is what we call an amorphous material, while gallium nitride is a crystalline material. And the amorphous nature of glass is actually why it's useful. So, and I'll just end by saying for this particular image that because it's amorphous, some people have chosen to calling these sorts of materials, which are glassy materials, liquid solids, which some people might agree with you, some people might not. I would tend to say that, yeah, it is a liquid solid. But something that's very obvious is that glass is used for making windows. And it's the fact that glass is amorphous, it has this sort of haphazard nature about it that makes it transparent, allowing us to use glass for windows, windshields in cars, again, test tubes and labs, and all the other applications that we can think of. So that's, those are just like 3 examples of material science in action, and especially the structure property relationship that I did try to highlight a lot. So the fact that this thing looks like this means that it obtains these properties, which then make it useful for these applications, right? And that's now that interplay that's actually at the core of material science. And if we just like consider other materials, so these are or what I'm trying to highlight in this image are the turbine blades of a jet engine. So these operate at very, very high temperatures. So people had to actually design new metals that didn't exist before. They're called nickel superalloys. So as opposed to normal metals, which weaken with temperature, these ones actually strengthen or get stronger with temperature, right? So because now we know how the property relates to the material, right, or the structure of the material, right, we can work backwards, if you will. So you can start off from the properties that you need for that specific application and actually make the material that you need. So instead of just like picking something that occurs naturally in the environment, we can design a specific material for a specific application, which is, you know, one of the beauties of material science. So back in the old days, you would just pick something that you can find, but now we're much more cleverer as human beings, and we can actually make something depending on the application. So again, these are jet engine blades. Another example is ferroelectric random access memory. So this is a RAM chip. So compared to magnetic memory, this one uses electric dipoles instead of magnetic dipoles, and that's all I will say about that one. This one is quite interesting to discuss. So what we're looking at here is self-healing concrete. So this is now a combination of both inorganics and organics, right? So living and non-living matter. So what they did here is that they mixed in some sort of bacteria with concrete, right? And the bacteria usually is dormant, as in it's asleep. But once the concrete actually cracks somewhat, the fact that now oxygen is getting into your bacteria awakens the bacteria. The bacteria start to activate, their metabolic processes occur, and they excrete calcite, which is produced to make the concrete. So that calcite that's excreted by the bacteria actually heals the concrete, hence the self-healing concrete. Then another example is materials for applications in replacements or implants. I'm not going to say a lot about this one. It seems quite self-explanatory. But again, there's a lot of material science that goes into it. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of brain power, if you will, that goes into actually achieving these things, because you're not just putting some beam of metal into the body. You need to consider how the metal actually reacts while it's inside the body. You need to match a lot of the strengths of the metals to the strengths of your bones to prevent bone reabsorption and other things, etc., etc. And then lastly, we have Gorilla Glass, which is used in iPhones and other phones, which is, so you can think of Gorilla Glass as normal glass that's been treated to increase the hardness of the surface. So remember I said hardness is, you know, the ease to which you, or the difficulty to which you can scratch the surface of your material. So Gorilla Glass, it goes through a process that actually increases the hardness. So it's very, very easy to, or it's very difficult to scratch Gorilla Glass. And again, it's all material science. I mean, chemistry and physics, you could argue, but I would say it's all material science. Okay. Now, then finally, I'd like to touch upon, I'm not sure how, okay, I think I might be out of time. I'd like to touch upon a bit of what I do. So I'm a PhD in materials, and like I said, I work on LEDs for display applications and also for general lighting with the light bulbs, and also for applications, not necessarily LEDs this time, but transistors for applications in telecommunications. And this is actually a radio satellite. And I wanted to discuss a bit more about what exactly I do. But again, in the interest of time, I think I've covered what I really wanted to cover. So we can just go straight to questions.
Awesome, thanks so much. And yeah, we'll see if we've got any specific questions and then move on to Aisha.
Okay.
We had one question near the start, which I think you spotted, that asked, what would you sort of suggest to do if things like A-level grades did not quite go to plan? So I guess what might you have done if your A-level grades hadn't been enough for the universities that you wanted to go to?
Okay, so the obvious thing there is clearing. I'm not sure if I can think of anything else besides maybe retaking the year and getting your grades done. But the obvious thing is to go into clearing. You need to talk to other universities that might be able to accept you, even though your grades might not be enough for the universities that you applied. There might be enough for some other universities. But besides that, retaking the year or just considering a gap year and just thinking about really what you want to do in life, what your life plan is.
Yeah, and there's always different universities that you could look at, and if you wanted to go, if you had one specific university in mind, let's say Cambridge for the sake of your example, you might always look at going there for like a master's or a PhD. So if you've got your heart set on one university, it doesn't work out the first time, you can do a second degree and go into something.
Which subject were you specifically enthusiastic in, and how did your interest in material science begin? So this might not have been obvious, but to some it should have been, that material science exists actually at the intersection of physics and chemistry. I would argue it's mostly physics than it is chemistry. So you can then try to extrapolate how my interest in material science actually came about. So from the start, I was very interested, very, very enthusiastic about chemistry, about physics, about just like how work in nature. But when it came to picking a subject, my options were kind of there were a lot of options. I could go into the engineering, the civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical and electronics, or I could go into more the pure sciences, so study physics, study chemistry. But at the end of the day, I was more interested in something that's more physical sciences, so physics and chemistry, but a bit more applications oriented, and material science sort of fit that that box that I wanted to be in. So yeah, so the subjects I was enthusiastic in were physics and chemistry, but mostly physics. And yeah, from that stemmed my interest in material science.
Awesome. We'll pass over to Aisha, who is also a PhD student in medical sciences, I believe. So the nice link there from talking about the hip replacement materials and into what you'll be talking about, Aisha.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Hello, everyone. So this would be a nice transition from the material sciences to like the medical sciences. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Aisha, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and my PhD is in the medical sciences. The medical sciences is super broad, so you could study anything and everything about the human body, but I specifically study cancer. And under cancer, I specifically study esophageal cancer. So before I go into the research theme in my lab, because as Kagiso also hinted, I would not really talk about my PhD project because it's very broad. So I think I'll just give you a nice bird's view of the whole circumstance and the whole premise. And then hopefully I can just mention a few things towards the end of the talk about my project, but then I'll just keep it broad. So before I go into that, I just want to talk a bit about myself and my academic journey. So I'm originally from Nigeria. I'm from the southwestern part of Nigeria, a really small town called Abeokuta. So Abeokuta is a very rocky place. So the good thing is that when you go rock climbing, you can really see you have a very beautiful view of the whole town because it's quite a small town relatively. So you can see like small houses and trees and stuff, which is really fun. So in 2016, I moved to Sweden to study biomedicine. At that time, I was 18. So I moved to Sweden to start a bachelor's in biomedicine because in Nigeria, I had lived in Nigeria all my life and I did my secondary school education and I was about to even start university before I got the scholarship to study at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. So if I were to summarize my time in Sweden in a few pictures, it would be the snowstorm. So we're quite a remarkable one because, you know, I had lived in Nigeria all my life, and Nigeria, like Africa in itself, is a warm place. So, you know, moving to the other part of the continent and adjusting to the weather, the culture, and all of that, it took me a while, but it was a reaching, like once I was able to, you know, adjust to to everything, it was really nice to change for me. And it was such a like pivotal part of my life because there were lots of things that I just had access to that I didn't have access to in the past. So yeah, even though the winter times were really tough, the sunset, the sunrises were things that I still miss to today. And yeah, so this is just like a nice summary of my time in Sweden. So this is the second and last slide about my the introductory part of this presentation. And basically this slide is just talk about my academic journey. So in 2019, June of 2019, I graduated from Karolinska Institute with a Bachelor's of Biomedicine. And in September 2019, I was awarded the Gates Cambridge Scholarship to study for a PhD in medical science at the University of Cambridge. And this was one of the most like thrilling times in my life, to be very honest. And it looks nice on the slide when I show that, okay, yes, I did a bachelor's and then I moved, I changed countries and then I got to Cambridge, and it looks really nice. But I think the question that you would ask is that, was this a straight path? And the reason why I ask this question is that sometimes when we see people that are, you know, attending this big universities in Kurt, or people who have attained some level of success, whatever you call it, people tend to think that, oh, these people were just born different, or these people are just, you know, smart from the very early on, or these people are, you know, have some type of superpowers, and I can't be like these people because, you know, there's some special breed in Kurt. But my journey wasn't a straight path. So I'd like to think of it as more of like, there are lots of things going on, because when I moved to Sweden, as I hinted on briefly in my first slide, there were lots of challenges that I had to overcome. To start with, like the culture, the language was a barrier. But then aside from that, even after when I was able to pick up a few language skills here and there, take language courses, there was also the part of not really understanding what research entails, because I moved to Sweden knowing little to nothing about research. So even though I had like some basic, because I did an A-level, right? I did A-level in biology, chemistry, and physics. And I had like, you know, the template, the foundation to sciences, but there's a lot more to research than what you're taught in A-levels. And so I struggled a bit when I first moved to Karolinska Institute. I struggled a bit, and it took me a while to sort of understand the concept, the basic concepts. And it's not just understanding the concept, you also need some lab skills. So it's not enough for you to know the theory behind things. You also need some day-to-day lab techniques, lab skills, how to calculate and do concentration, dilution, experiments, and all of that kind of stuff. So there are lots of nuances that are associated with research, aside from the things that you see in your book. So for me, it was challenging, but I'd like to think that because I felt like I was challenged, it sort of, you know, motivated me such that I had this goal in my head of where I wanted to be, and I allowed that goal to push me. So even if at that time it was challenging, I didn't understand most of the things that were happening, it's sort of, I think with this kind of thing, you can only think about it two ways. It's either you allow it to drain you and you allow it to make you feel like you're not good enough, or you use that as an empowering, like something to empower you and push you, and just to prove to yourself that, yes, like I can do this, I can absolutely do this. So I'd like to think that I took the second mode, even though sometimes, of course, I would not lie that there were times I doubted myself, it was challenging. But again, at the end of the day, I think the point of this slide is just to say that, like, like the journey to success most times is not linear, or it's not straightforward for most people. There's a lot of things that go in the background that you don't see. And sometimes when you're going through rough patches as well, when you have this big goal in your head, don't let those rough patches affect you, because it's all part of the journey. It's something that is natural to go through, and don't let it be something that would put you off from going to that dream school that you've always dreamt, like you've always thought of, or taking that course that you've always dreamt of. So now that I've finished with the background introduction part, I would move on to so what we study in my lab, which is esophageal cancer. And I will talk about the Cytosponge actually, which is a really cool device that my lab developed. So before I go into that, I thought that it's nice for me to talk a bit about what the esophagus is. And that's because other body parts are quite common to most people. So on our day-to-day basis, we talk about the legs, hands, nose, mouth, and all of that. But the esophagus is quite an organ that is not so common to most people because we don't mention it on a day-to-day basis. So I thought it was going to be very helpful to introduce what the esophagus is. So it's basically the food pipe, and that's basically what connects your mouth to your stomach. So it's that long tube here. So that's the esophagus. And now that we know what the esophagus is, the next thing that we can ask is that why do we study the cancer of the esophagus? So in this world, you can think of so many things that people die from, but cancer is still the second most common cause of death globally. And sadly enough, everyone knows someone who has cancer or who has passed away from cancer. So it's important that it's important that we carry out research to tackle this disease, fight it, and also to find ways to detect it early, and just even if we can find some type of treatment or cure. So research in this part is very, very important. And why study the cancer of the esophagus specifically? So the problem with the esophageal cancer is that most times when people present with symptoms in the clinics, it's usually at a late stage. And what I mean by late stage is that the cancer has metastasized to so many different parts of the body. And also it's just a lot harder to treat it because it's already advanced. So that is why the research team in my lab focuses on early detection, because we believe that if you can detect the cancer early enough, you can seek treatment. And interestingly, for esophageal cancer specifically, there are actually good treatments that can give you a good 5-year mortality. The 5-year mortality rate is really low. So like when you get the treatment, which is basically surgery, you're more likely to be cured of the cancer, but that's only if it's detected early enough. So the research, as I said, the research in my lab focuses on how can we detect this esophageal cancer early enough such that most people don't pass away from it when they do develop it. So there are two types of esophageal cancer. There's squamous cell adenocarcinoma, there's squamous cell carcinoma and esophageal adenocarcinoma. And I have acronyms here just because I feel like acronyms help to limit the amount of scientific jargons that we communicate sometimes. So when I just say OSCC, this is what I mean. And when I say OAC, this is what I mean. And it's interesting because even though these two cancer types originate from the same organ, which is the esophagus, they are completely different cancer types. So the risk factors are different. The pathological characteristics are different. Even the even the symptoms are different. So for example, the OSCC, the risk factors, what increases the risk of OSCC? Tobacco, alcohol overconsumption, malnutrition, hot food and beverages also increase the risk. And adenocarcinoma, the things that increase the risk for that, the OAC, is heartburn. So for those who don't know, the heartburn is basically, so normally when we eat, the food is supposed to follow gravity and goes to the stomach. But there's sometimes that the food stays in the chest because of pathophysiological abnormalities and stuff. So that causes inflammation. And if that causes inflammation, you start to develop a hot sensation at your chest area. And these are the things that cause the heartburn symptoms. So we see that people that have heartburn have higher risk of developing OAC. Also people that have obesity in their abdomen. And interestingly, even though most people that we see in the clinics with esophageal cancer are old, there's still a few younger, like old, over 60, that's what I mean by old, or over 50, but there's still young people like 30 that also develop this cancer type. So one thing I just want to mention before I move to my next slide is that even though these two types, again, these two types of cancer have distinct geographical distribution. So OSCC is more common in developing countries like East Africa, Central Asia, and whereas OAC is more common in the UK, in the West generally. So it's interesting to see this disparity, even though it's still esophageal cancer. So I think this is a really fun part, and this is a really cool part. So when we collect esophageal cancer tissues from our patients, we can't, if we look under the microscope, we can't really see anything going on because they appear blank. So what we have to do first is to stain the cells. And what I mean by staining, just paint the cells with some chemical compounds that I do not want to go into, but essentially the point of staining these tissues is to produce some type of contrast. And when we see the contrast, we're able to, know if this is cancer or not. So we use the light microscope after staining the tissue samples from patients, and you will see that the normal esophagus looks really smooth and there's nothing going on. So compare it to stage 1 pre-cancer, stage 2, and actual cancer, you can see that the abnormalities are totally like different. And even though I wrote stage 1, stage 2 here, these are like not the actual names for the stages, but because to just make everything as simple as possible, that's why I have it as stage 1 and stage 2. So esophageal cancer is quite an interesting cancer in the sense that you can think of it as a staircase effect, because there are not so many cancer types that develop in a grade by grade process. So even though, of course, there's some patients that we see in the clinics that do not go through all of these stages and they just come up with a cancer, but generally from research, from the things that we've studied, we see that this cancer develops in a stage by stage manner. And the good thing is that because it develops in a stage by stage manner, it provides us with an opportunity to detect it early, because if we can detect it at this stage, we can cure it, in quote. So you can think of esophageal cancer as like the staircase effect, whereas you increase the stage, it becomes worse and the chances of you surviving it is lower. So how is esophageal? So remember that I mentioned to you that the problem with esophageal cancer is that it's detected late, and that's why most people die from it. But the problem again, there are so many things that can cause the reason why esophageal cancer is detected late. But what I want to focus on at the moment is the mode of diagnosis. So at the moment, there are two things that we use to diagnose esophageal cancer. There is endoscopy and there is histopathological assessment. So endoscopy is basically a fancy word for camera down the throat. So there's a small camera that the doctor inserts through the food pipe. And the idea is that the camera goes down the food pipe, and then we're able to, image the food pipe to see if there are lesions that are growing. So for example, the image that I have is shown here, you can see some white things. So this is like early signs of cancer, basically. But because this is not very, you can't really depend on this. So we need to also collect biopsies along the food pipe. And what I mean by biopsies is that we need to collect tissue, small tissue. We can't collect the whole tissue because you start to perforate and bleed. So we collect small tissues along the esophagus, maybe 3 to 4, and then we stain those tissues then to see if the cancer that we detect via imaging is truly present. So again, this has been working for quite a while successfully in the hospital, but we have to appreciate that there are some challenges that are associated with this modality of diagnosis. The first is that it's expensive. So I think I've read that it costs about £400 for one endoscopy procedure. So if a method is supposed to diagnose people early enough and it's very expensive, that means it's not accessible to a lot of people. And that's one of the reasons why many people are being missed by it. The second is it's painful. So I personally have had endoscopy done, I think 2 to 3 years ago. And I can mention that it's one of the least pleasant experiences I've ever had in a while. So yeah, it's like when you have a camera, it's like you're gagging, there's a lot of reflex going on, and it's just not a fun thing to do. So that's another challenge. And the third is that it's prone to diagnostic mistakes. And I will explain this a bit by giving an analogy using a pen. So I don't know if you can see my screen. So imagine that this is your food pipe. So this is the esophagus. So what the doctor does is that to diagnose esophageal cancer, we can't collect tissues along the entire food pipe. As I mentioned, like you start to bleed because it's a lot of tissue collection. So what the doctor does is that he picks 3 or 4 random areas along the food pipe, hoping that if a person has cancer, at least one of those 4 biopsies would reflect the cancer present. And you have to appreciate that with this approach, there are some times that you're lucky and then you pick the cancer, but there's also a chance that the doctor just doesn't pick the areas with the lesions. So you can think of it like gambling, more or less. So even if you come with a biopsy that says that this person doesn't have cancer, there's a chance that the person has it just because the doctor didn't pick the right area of the esophagus. So with all of these challenges and limitations in mind, and again, I just want to reiterate that it's not like I'm downplaying endoscopy as a terrible technique, because again, this has been used in the hospital for a very long time, and it's helped to a degree. But as scientists, we always think of ways to improve on things, and we just don't accept the mediocre or average things. So we try to look for ways to improve and make things more efficient. And with those challenges in mind, my lab developed something called the Federal Lab developed it, but it's now licensed to Medtronic. So it's the Cytosponge Test, which is basically a cheap and simple device that we are currently researching in my lab as a test to diagnose esophageal cancer. So I just have very short, like 30 seconds video, two 30-second videos to show you how the cytosponge works.
And slowly down the esophagus and into the top of the stomach. Then you just wait 3 or 4 minutes and the capsule will dissolve. And as it dissolves, the tightly compressed sponge within the capsule will pop open. So then after 5 minutes has passed, to be sure that sponge is opened up, a nurse just simply pulls the sponge out of the esophagus. And as it moves along the passage of the esophagus, it will collect cells on this sort of honeycomb lattice. And you end up with about...
So again, so basically what happens is instead of having a camera device go around, you have this really small, I would have bought one to show you, but I don't have it with me. We have it at the lab. So it's just like a string and a pill, like it's like a pill size, then you swallow it. Once it gets to the stomach, it decompresses because of the fluid environment, and then it becomes a sponge. And then as you pull the string, then the sponge, because it's abrasive, it has a very hard surface. It collects the cells along the esophagus, and the idea is that it collects the entire cells along the esophagus. So you're not picking specific parts in it, like in endoscopy. So you're less likely to have sampling errors as endoscopy. So we can think of it, I have this nice illustration here by Chris Madden, which shows how the cytosponge works. So you can basically think of it as you're fishing for cancer, because you have the sponge in, and then you're just hoping that, okay, if the aberrant cells are present, the sponge picks it up. So now I've given, so what's next for the Cytosponge test? I think that's a good question that one can ask, because research, I think the point of this slide is just to communicate that research takes a lot of time. So I don't know if you can imagine that the idea of the cytosponge came about in around 2000-ish, and it's currently 2021. And this is the closest we've ever been to clinical implementation. So at the moment, it's been adopted slowly in some hospitals in the UK, but it took almost 21 years of research to be able to get to this point. And this is just to reiterate that when you're thinking of research that is translational, you just don't come up with things and then throw it to patient to use. So you have to test it for its adverse effect, for so many other things are like logistics, the cost. There are so many things that you have to evaluate rigorously before you introduce it into the clinics. So the Cytosponge has gone through so many, and there will still be more studies that it would go through, but it's just to give you a rough idea of how long it takes to take a concept or an idea from bench all the way to clinics. And what my PhD project specifically focuses on is to test, so when we collect cells from the cytosponge, how can we do some type of molecular profiling, like look at the genetics, so look at the genomic data of the cells that we collect, and are we able to use those genomic data set that we accumulate to detect if the esophageal cancer is present. So that's what if I were to summarize my PhD project, that's what it focuses on. So yeah, it's a very, very long process, yes, but absolutely, it's worth it at the end. And it's extremely rewarding, especially when you see how people are being impacted positively by what you spent so much time on in the lab. So yeah, research is generally a very long process, but it's worth it at the end. And before this is my second to the last slide. And just to show you, my lab currently has over 40 people so working on this project and other projects. And again, this is just to reiterate that amazing things happen when lots of people come together with extraordinary ideas, and that's when you see things coming. It's rarely one person. I mean, even though yes, my boss here, Professor Rebecca Fitzgerald, was the one who came up with the idea of the cytosponge, it was when she was able to collaborate with different people from different disciplines, and that's when the success that we see today is able to come about. So amazing ideas come together when lots of people collaborate and bring their knowledge to fix a particular challenge that is being faced in clinics. And I guess my last slide. So when I was coming to Cambridge, it was really hard for me to, not when I was coming to Cambridge, during my undergrad years, when I was thinking of what to do next, and I looked at like universities like Cambridge and Harvard and whatnot, it was really hard for me to find people that look like me in this space. So even though, yeah, it's one thing to have a dream, but it's also another thing to have someone representing that dream that you have. And for me, it was really hard, as I say, it was really hard for me to find someone in that space, someone who was young like myself, and also someone who was passionate like the way I was. So since I moved to Cambridge and since I started my PhD, I've been thinking of ways to sort of be a support for someone like myself a couple of years ago, who was thinking of someone to look up to or someone to ask for advice from. And with that mindset, I started a channel maybe 7 to 8 months ago, where I document my journey on YouTube. The name of the channel is Practice Makes Pipette. So if this is something that you're interested in, if you're interested in cancer research or just want to know what it's like to do a PhD, or like the practicalities of doing a PhD or studying University of Cambridge, if you're interested in all those kind of things, you can check it out and also just join the community if you want. With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if possible.
Awesome, thanks so much, Aisha. There was a couple of questions sort of as we're going through. One, I think that you sort of answered through the talk, but someone's asked specifically around when you got your scholarships, were there any challenges to getting them, and how did you overcome them?
So for the Gates Cambridge scholarship, I think the first challenge for me was the IELTS exam. So I applied to Cambridge in my second to the last year of my undergrad. So my undergrad was 3 years, and I applied in the second year, and I knew that I got the scholarship around February or March, or I knew I got into Cambridge around February or March in my final year of my undergrad. But then I saw that they gave me a conditional admission. So one of it was I had to take the IELTS exam. Even though my bachelor's was in English, I studied, like all my years, I've always studied in English, but they said that I had to take an IELTS exam. So I had to fit taking an IELTS exam into my final year, and then I was defending my thesis as well. So that was quite hard for me. But again, I think I just dedicated 1 month out of my thesis writing time in my final year to just focus on studying for the exam, and then thankfully I was able to navigate that successfully. So that was one challenge.
And then more specifically about the Cytosponge, you said that obviously the endoscope was not a particularly pleasant experience when you had it done. Yeah. When you have a Cytosponge, does it hurt or does it feel weird or awkward when it's moving through the esophagus?
That's also actually a good question. So I mentioned that there are lots of adverse effects that have to be checked before you implement anything into the clinic. So one of the adverse effects of Cytosponge is that you feel like you have a sore throat after you take it. So you take it with water. So you have a pill, you drink water, it goes to your stomach, and then you pull it out. So people usually complain that they have this sore throat feeling, but it lasts for maybe a day, and that's it. So that's the biggest side effect that I can think about from the Cytosponge. But then in comparison to endoscopy,
if it's not as bad as the endoscope, then hopefully people will be more willing to have it, and hopefully then you can detect cancers earlier.
One thing I just wanted to mention is the poll question that I wanted to ask. I forgot about that completely.
Yes, so we have a poll question, so that this should jump up on your screen, and basically it's going to ask you whether if you needed this test done, would you prefer an endoscope or would you prefer a Cytosponge? I can't vote, but I think the Cytosponge sounds slightly more pleasant, and I think also as someone who likes science, I think I'd be also excited to be able to help a new scientific method be tested. Right. Yeah, everyone's gone for the Cytosponge. Everyone definitely agreed that it sounds more comfortable than an endoscope.
Yeah, an endoscope is not comfortable at all, especially if you're not sedated.
And then someone as a follow-up has asked, if the Cytosponge is successful in its trials, how long do you think it'll take before it becomes sort of a mainstream method? Which is a really good question.
So yeah, that's a really good question, because as I mentioned, so we've been testing the Cytosponge since 2000. Not we, but my lab has been, and this is the closest we are to clinical implementation. So even at that, I'd say maybe 5 to 10 years, just because you have to accumulate a lot of scientific evidence before you can bring something. And it's not only about the efficiency of the method, it's also about the cost effectiveness. So even if you're saying that the Cytosponge, the endoscopy is very expensive, like if you have lots of people take the Cytosponge, would the money always almost equate to the money that you spend with endoscopy? So there's a lot of things that is associated with clinical implementation. But that being said, I feel like maybe 5 to 10 years-ish, it should get into like mainstream.
So it's quite a long time from first idea through to actually seeing lots of patients.
Yeah, and to be honest, there are lots of other cool devices that are being developed for esophageal cancer as well that are somewhat similar to the Cytosponge, but out of all of them, the Cytosponge is the one that has accumulated the most evidence, not just in the UK, but also in the US, because we have some, competitors in the US as well. But because it's one thing to develop a very amazing technique, but another thing to be committed to it and study it extensively. So yeah,
Awesome. We will wrap up in just a second, but the thing I like to ask all of our speakers on this series is if you could talk to your sort of 16-year-old self again and tell them one piece of advice, what would you tell them? So I'll ask both of you, so whoever wants to go first.
I'm just going to think. Okay, I just thought of one. Just because it takes long to achieve your dreams doesn't mean that you shouldn't have those dreams as a goal, because time will pass anyway.
Awesome.
I would say something similar to trust your abilities. You're pretty good, you're smart, worry less, and things will turn out well in the end.
Awesome. Really nice ending messages. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Next week is our last in this series for this academic year, and we'll be joined by someone who works in aerospace engineering, so quite different from this week. So there'll be information on that on the email you'll get from Eventbrite tomorrow, so don't worry about finding that just now. But thank you very much for both of you for joining us. I definitely learned loads about both material science and specifically about the cytosponge. That's really, really interesting. So thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.